What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Wuchang Fallen Feathers, a recently released Souls-like that I think does a few interesting things, has some fun boss fights, some good levels, but also has a fair few systems I'm not a fan of, like its madness mechanic. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though a couple of extra things in the case of this game, I did in fact receive a review key for this. I actually initially started playing it around July 10th or so, which is how I'm bringing you this video so close to the game's release date. I actually put out a launch review a couple of days ago, and as it turns out, I was a little closer to being done with this than I thought, so rather than this weekend, this is probably going up like Friday. After the game released, I was able to actually look up a couple of the things I had not gotten yet, which helped in speeding that process up. It also helps that after New Game Plus 2, the game seems to stop scaling, meaning that you will just sort of overlevel the content at that point. Though I will go ahead and link that guide that I took a look at, mostly because it seems to be very thorough and will likely answer your questions more in depth than I plan on doing in this video. I will say, before we move on though, the Quelling Madness achievement I wanted to mention specifically because the description for it does not match what you need to actually do, or at least it doesn't elaborate on it very well. That achievement sees you killing 6 inner demons, which are these monsters you can spawn, which we will go over, and while they can spawn when you die, the 6 inner demons it's actually referring to are set mini-bosses that only appear in certain locations. And it's not enough to kill just 6 of them total across your runs, you have to kill each individual mini-boss, which is in total 6 of them. So simply put, that achievement was very poorly worded, and I wanted to call it out. Otherwise, let's dive fully into this thing. So as I mentioned, I did do a launch review for this, which was just a couple days ago, so some of this might be a little bit of a rehash, but Wuchang Fallen Feathers is a Souls-like, of course, and in many ways, it's a pretty by-the-books Souls-like. In fact, if you've played many games in that genre, you should feel right at home here. And while it does most everything fairly competently, there are a few systems that I think are especially hit or miss, like the Madness system, which sees you potentially being punished for struggling. That is to say, it causes you to take more damage as you fail, which if you're already struggling might very well feel like a double punishment to the failure of just losing. There are also certain abilities and things tied to disciplines that I feel like would be better off as a base mechanic, such as blocking or countering. Those aren't things you can do just automatically, but you have to assign them to weapons, and I'm honestly not a huge fan of those systems. But in spite of that, it does have a variety of cool boss fights. I really enjoyed the levels, and while the biomes are pretty by the books, the actual design of the individual levels was pretty enjoyable. That combined with the usual sort of opaqueness of the secrets inherent to a Souls-like game made for, I would say honestly, a pretty mixed experience for me. I'm leaning a little more towards the favorable side generally, just because I do think it is better than many Souls-likes I have played, but it's also definitely not top tier for me either. Before we go any farther though, let's talk about the technical state of the game, because while in the launch review I mentioned that the game was not having really any substantial problems for me during the review period, that remains true, mind you. I only had a single crash and then occasionally the game would stutter. If you've looked at the PC user reviews already, you might be very well aware that the game is running quite poorly for a lot of people. Now, doing a little bit of cursory research into this, it does seem that more than a few of people's problems they're running into are having to do with the various frame gen technologies. So if you're looking to troubleshoot this because you've already bought it, I would personally start there. Otherwise, be advised that it does seem this game is giving a lot of people some performance issues. Not everybody, though. In fact, as I mentioned, I was mostly alright, just a couple of stutters and that one crash. And if you're curious, my system specs are in the About section of the channel, but I have a higher-end PC than most, and that may very well be accounting for the differences. The other thing I wanted to mention in this section is the PC keybinds. So, I mentioned this in my initial review, but to be a little more clear, because people were asking questions about it, you can rebind the keyboard controls. However, what the game won't let you do is freely use every key on a keyboard. there are a variety of keys that they do not allow you to use. I'm never a fan of that, especially as a PC channel. I want to be able to freely rebind any key on a keyboard, and while yes, it is true that thanks to various macros and things like that, it's possible to change them anyway. It's annoying, and I feel like a game in 2025 releasing on PC, that should kind of be the minimum. So as far as the technical state goes, definitely some huge things to take note of there. Performance seems bad for a lot of people, and while you might get lucky, the odds aren't in your favor there. The game does seem to be having some serious issues, but that brings us to the difficulty and New Game Plus. So this game does have one singular difficulty, which means you're going to have to overcome the challenges, and as a Souls-like, that's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. I do think the first playthrough is generally going to be the hardest, both because you're simultaneously learning the boss fights, but also because the way the game handles progression, you're going to be a little tight on skill points unless you feel like grinding, and thanks to the game's mostly linear levels, that's not exactly an enjoyable experience. Because of that, I did want to call out the New Game Plus cycles specifically. This is important for a variety of reasons, mostly because there are multiple endings, and if you want to see them all, you're going to have to make use of them. But I found stepping into New Game Plus almost immediately to feel much, much better, because while the game will scale with you for the first few New Game Plus cycles, they do not scale nearly as fast as you start progressing, which means you get much more overpowered and can run through the game pretty quickly at that point, just to see the things you've missed. To give that a sort of frame of reference, my first playthrough was about 35 hours, my second was 20, my third was about 15, and my final one was like 5 or 6. This is in large part because New Game Plus only scales up to New Game Plus 2. So if you can beat that third run, which should already be pretty easy because you're going to be outpacing your enemies anyway, the progression on that scaling fully stops after New Game Plus 2, which means when you get to your fourth run, it's going to be the exact same as your last third run, and so you should just kind of be rolling over enemies at that point. All that to say that most of the difficulty is front-loaded, it can be overcome, the game actually gets much easier the farther in you go, and while I think there are definitely some difficulty spikes, especially right at the end of the first area, as Souls-likes go, it's not really that bad. I do, however, wish it was a little bit smoother in its overall progression. Like, for instance, I think the first playthrough was harder than it really needed to be in general, and if they would have just adjusted that a bit to let you use more of the game's combat system, which really opens up a New Game Plus and gets fun, it would have been a better overall experience, which is probably my main detraction from enjoying the game to begin with. From there, though, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. So we are still pretty close to the release date of this game. I obviously don't want to spoil everything for people, and so I am obviously not going to go into great depth on the story. If you want to go in completely fresh, I don't know why you've been listening up to this point, to be honest, but go ahead and skip past this part, I guess. As there are still a few things I want to mention here, but Wuchang Fallen Feathers takes place during the late Ming Dynasty in China, and while that will likely give you a little bit of context and things to the characters and whatnot that you'll be meeting, it doesn't play like a gigantic role in the story either, because the story is mostly about an event called the Feathering. Basically, a mysterious illness is spreading that is causing feathers to pop up on people, which eventually turns them into horrifying monsters, and much of the story revolves around getting to the bottom of the what and why that is happening, which, if you're paying attention, the game will pretty well spell out for you, and that's the part I'm definitely not going to spoil, of course. Now, it does have a lot of implications around items you can find called chisels. It also touches on themes of like resurrection, family ties, the cyclical nature of life and death, many such things you may very well expect from dark fantasy in general. Now, then there are the endings. There are ultimately 4 different endings for this game, and initially I was pretty intrigued by them after like the first and the second one especially. And while I will say that each individual ending does give a lot of context to the story overall, I did find them to be a bit underwhelming, frankly, because while I initially thought that they were building towards something, they kind of just wound up falling flat, especially after I finished my last run. And I just don't feel like any of them provided a particularly satisfying conclusion to the game's narrative. But, that's just my opinion. But speaking for me, playing through this game 4 different times to see these different endings after, doing the things to puzzle out how to get them to begin with and everything, I just don't feel like that was worth the effort for the conclusion of it. So when it comes to the story, it's fine. Some of it's pretty interesting. I like how they present the lore and stuff, which again is honestly pretty standard Souls-like stuff at this point, but ultimately it's just okay. I've seen worse, I've seen better. That brings us into progression, though. This game does have a wide variety of progression systems, namely in the form of its level up system, which is like called the impetus directory or something like that, which looks like a giant skill tree, but in practice is really more like a traditional Souls-like level up system. Basically, as we gain Red Mercury, our experience, we can refine that into Red Mercury Essence here at this screen and then spend it on various skill nodes, which comprise your level ups. It's also worth mentioning that you can get the Red Mercury Essence, or a level up, from both defeating bosses directly as well as defeating special, powerful versions of the monsters you'll be encountering along the way, and that can, as a result, just straight up give you extra skill points. Now, while this is presented to you as a skill tree, and to some degree it is, it's important to note that stat scaling for your weapons is still a thing here, meaning that certain types of weapons scale off of the different stat nodes better or worse. Now the catch here is the skill tree is divided up into general and magic and then all of your different weapon types. And each weapon type has the stat nodes that weapon scales off of. So it's kind of hard to mess up stat scaling, but it is a thing here. Now, once you get into the late New Game Plus cycles, this gets especially powerful because then you can get the stats from the skill trees you're not even using, which will maximize both your damage and your stats as well, which is one of the reasons the game gets so easy once the game stops scaling at all. Now, the other thing you need to know about these particular individual skill trees is that they also contain other upgrades. This is where you're going to go to upgrade things like your health or your healing items, the potency of those healing items, the amount of tempering charges you have, which we'll get into, the amount of charges you have for a few different other things, the abilities you have with each weapon, and even the upgrades to those weapons. Most of those specific upgrades, though, also require extra materials beyond just the skill points. For instance, the feathers, which you need to upgrade your weapons, the special items from golden chests that you need to upgrade your healing items. So it's important to note that not everything is just skill points on this. You can also freely respec from this tree. There is no cost to that, which is especially useful in your first run when, again, upgrades and stuff are very, very limited without grinding, which obviously I didn't want to do, but the free respecs are genuinely pretty useful in that first run. Now, there are other forms of progression via things like gear of sorts. There are a variety of armor sets, though I will say those wind up not being particularly impactful because they do not get extra versions. That is to say, in the New Game Plus cycles, things like your pendants get +1, +2 versions. Armor does not do that. Armor is just the base armor set, and as a result of that, they all have different resistances to various things, and there's a case to be made for swapping them out, but I will say that your starter set seems to be the best all-around set, with switching from that usually coming down to taking increased damage from certain things as the cost for the upgraded resistance to what that set covers. So as a result, I honestly found the starting bit of armor to be kind of the best for me personally anyway. There are also pendants. You can equip up to 3 of these. They have a wide variety of effects. In New Game Plus cycles, they go up to +1 or +2 versions, getting stronger as you go, of course. There are also your weapons. There are a wide variety of weapons, 5 different types, each category having a few different individual weapons inside that category, mostly 5 each besides longswords. And that's important because each weapon within a type does actually have unique bits of scaling and things like that, so it's not entirely one for each weapon, and each weapon also has a set discipline that only that weapon has, making all of them play a little bit differently. You'll upgrade these weapons via your skill tree and whatnot. My personal favorites were the longsword, and specifically a longsword called, I think it was Lashing Whip or something like that increased its range as you swung, which was a lot of fun for me personally. But your weapons also get to make use of the benediction system. Benedictions are basically rune stones that you can find and pick up and assign to one of 3 slots on your weapon based on the type. For the most part, these just provide buffs to the weapon that you're using, but it is possible to make certain combinations of these runestones marked by a little icon on the runestone itself that will tell you that they're all in a set, and if you make a set of benedictions that are runestones all from the same set, you'll get an extra effect as well, and these also scale up to +2 before that stops. Now, if you put all of those things together, you can come up with some pretty fun builds. However, I did want to point out that magic does not seem to scale super well past your first playthrough, damage-wise, that is. Utility spells remain extremely useful throughout. In fact, there is a damage-absorbing bubble that you can get that made a lot of fights dramatically easier for me, at least, and obviously that's not a damage thing, so it didn't really matter that its damage didn't scale. But this is in part because while you do have like magic and things that will increase your magic damage, the spells themselves do not get better the way everything else does. So I'd be surprised if that, in like a future update or something, didn't get some sort of scaling to keep them a little more relevant in the late game. But speaking of spells, another sort of bit of indirect progression is in fact just that, doing things like collecting the spells and the weapons from the environment, which sometimes can come down to answering NPCs in a certain way, completing their quests, finding optional bosses, stuff like that. So probably unsurprising, but some of the progression is just like where that stuff comes from to begin with. Keeping it moving into the gameplay and world section though. So this game is mostly linear levels. Each level does have a little bit of exploration. They are not like a complete hallway through each one, but they are for the most part pretty linear. Like all Souls-likes, you're going to find shrines which act as your checkpoints, which is where you're going to do your leveling up, set your benedictions, your tempering, which we'll get into, all that stuff. Now, while these are pretty linear levels, it is a big interconnected world, meaning that each sort of level that you find yourself in is connected to the rest of the areas that you will go to, up until you get to, I believe it's like chapter 3 is how the game talks about it, but basically there's a point of no return where one of the areas changes drastically, and you cannot go back and do stuff after that point. Now, that's also kind of the case for the NPCs, who, once you defeat bosses and stuff, will no longer give you certain dialogues, which can absolutely affect things like the various endings. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the review, this game is a lot of very standard biomes. In fact, I think if you were to make a list, the only thing this one doesn't really do is like a big desert area. But other than that, it's a pretty by-the-books fantasy game biome situation. You got your starter forest, you got your snowy area, you've got your on-fire living area type place, you've got your liminal space. It's very just like, again, by-the-books biomes. Now, don't let that distract you, though, from the fact that I do think the level design itself is really good. It does a pretty good job of doing that thing where Souls-likes kind of loop back in on themselves and you open up shortcuts to make your life easier to get to shrines and things. So the actual act of running through these areas, as linear as they are, is still a pretty enjoyable experience, and they do kind of mess around a bit with verticality, especially in some of them, which I thought was a fun touch. So overall, I am actually a pretty big fan of the levels themselves, besides one where you have to get around these guys who have an aura that they put out that builds up a status effect on you that is just a one-shot if it fills up, which got annoying fast. But for the most part, it was an enjoyable game to actually just run around. Inside each of these areas, we have, as I mentioned, the various NPCs. They are going to have quests for us to give us information, things like that. Doing these quests will see you both rewarded with actual items, things like weapons, spells, that sort of stuff. It's also possible to summon these guys into combat, typically if you do their quests. That does not always happen for every boss, and to be honest with you, their damage is negligible, but they do sometimes provide a convenient distraction, especially on the earlier playthroughs where you're not as familiar with the overall encounter yet. There are merchants, of course, where you can also spend your experience on items and spells and whatnot, that kind of thing. In order to expand the inventory of these guys, you have to find items that drop off of both bosses, as well as items out in each individual level, typically in some slightly more hidden area that will then expand their inventory if you take it back to them. There's also other secrets to find, things like the gates. There are two kinds of gates, yellow and red. The yellow ones you will just open and they will give you a benediction stone while also providing you typically like a shortcut of some sort. And then there's the red ones. These ones are interesting because there's an achievement for answering the riddles the red doors give you correctly. There's 3 of them to be specific, but what I thought was interesting about this is that it was initially hard to tell if I was doing this right or wrong because no matter how you answer, something happens. So the right answer to these doors' riddles will open it up and then give you access to whatever's behind the door in some cases, which, varies for each one, of course, but is generally pretty interesting. And the odd thing is if you answer it wrong, what the door will do is actually teleport you somewhere else, which might actually be more where you want to go, as there are important things hidden behind those teleports if you answer these doors wrong, as the game's achievement puts it. So I thought that was an especially odd little thing, but no matter how you answer, you'll probably want to do at least both in between all the runs if you're trying to do everything, but that can lead to more secrets. There's obviously things like optional bosses, stuff you can miss entirely if you're not thoroughly exploring and backtracking to important places at certain times, and overall, it's an enjoyable Souls-like experience, if, again, a little by the books. That does bring us to combat, however. Combat is an interesting one because I liked a good bit of it. I liked the feel of a lot of the weapons and how it was to move around things. I found enjoyable move sets that I actually had a good time playing with, and yet it has systems like the Madness system that I am just not a fan of, to be honest. But let's get into it. So, probably the biggest thing to know about combat is the Skyborn Might mechanic. Depending on your weapon upgrades and the upgrades to your maximum Skyborn Might, as you do things like, say, dodge out of the way or attack enemies with combos, you'll be gaining Skyborn Might charges. Skyborn Might increases the damage you deal with things like disciplines, so it's important if you want to use your big moves, but it's also what you're going to spend to do things like utilize your spells. That is really important even if you're not a magic user because of, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the utility spells. There are utility spells that can do things like just straight up block damage. My personal favorite was the damage bubble I also mentioned earlier, which honestly felt a little overpowered, but you don't get it until pretty close to the end of your first run, so that's probably how they planned on balancing that a little bit, but it was a very good time. Then there's your weapon types and your disciplines. So this is actually really important because while you can do things like, say, use a longsword, which is like a two-handed sword, a one-handed sword, an axe, dual wielding, or a spear as an example, each of these have sort of strengths and weaknesses generally, and they each get access to various disciplines, of course. So for me, I didn't like the axe because it was super slow. The spear was pretty fun, and then the dual wield and the one-handed sword were a little too short range for me. I like to have a little more distance than that, so the spear and the longsword were kind of where I ended up, but mostly the longsword. The catch is, though, you kind of need to have a pretty good idea of what weapon you want to use because outside of just determining your playstyle more generally, things like blocking and then even countering or parrying are going to be behind disciplines, typically found in your skill tree. So, if you want to block, that's usually something like an axe. Whereas if I want to counter, that's, stuff like the longsword, but it has a discipline you have to attach to the weapon, that is to say, equip it to the weapon, in order to actually use it. You cannot do those things by default unless that discipline is on your weapon. I was not a huge fan of that system generally. I feel like those are sort of default actions I should have available to me, not at the discretion of a discipline, and it felt really clunky, especially in boss fights where they were very clearly trying to be like, this is how this mechanic works, but there's a good chance you might not even have access to the mechanic they're trying to teach you. And yes, you can use the respec and everything to get access to it. It's just clunky, to be honest with you, and I wasn't a huge fan of how that system worked together. Especially since if I have to attach those disciplines to a weapon, then I can't, use other stuff like the big attacks, as you can only have 2 equipped. And it just feels like an unnecessary limitation that I was not a huge fan of. But that's not the only thing. We also get tempering. So right after, I think it's like the first major boss, you unlock tempering. Tempering gives you an item that then allows you to imbue your weapon with a set of stats based on how you've set it up. So tempering becomes a menu in the shrines and stuff you can access, and via items that you'll get from destroying like inner demon mini bosses in set locations and stuff, as well as various upgrades in your skill tree to customize what exactly tempering your weapon in combat will do for you. So you can provide status effects like, flame, life leech, that kind of thing. Personally, I was a huge fan of life leech in this game. I think it is incredibly strong because you can just, sort of brute force some things on occasion, which if you've ever watched me play a Souls-like tends to be a little more up my alley. But I did like just how customizable this tempering system was. I liked how much sort of granular control they gave over exactly what bonuses and stuff it was doing for you. But this is actually another thing that I didn't get to mess around with too much until my second playthrough because I just didn't feel like I had the skill points to really lean into it. which is another good time to highlight again that the combat system is great once it opens up on like the second playthrough. I found the first playthrough to be really restrictive in that regard, and I feel like this game would benefit from getting you to that point faster, especially because it does have some other interesting mechanics. One thing I really enjoyed was the heavy charge attack system. So I actually got an upgrade where you could spend Skyborn Might to make this even faster, but you can do heavy charge attacks, and if you hit a human enemy in the back, it pretty much immediately staggers them and opens them up to an obliteration attack. Basically, a staggered enemy will, be susceptible to a giant attack, as in many games, which is called the obliterate here, and I had another thing that gave me health when I did that, on top of the life leech from the tempering, and that and the damage bubble even, I wound up making myself pretty hard to kill. And stuff like that was fun to mess around with, but as I just mentioned a moment ago, I think the game could do a much better job of getting you to the fun parts faster. But that does bring me to my second to last thing I want to talk about for combat, which is the madness system. So I don't really enjoy this system, to be honest. I was kind of on the fence about it, but the more I play with it, the more I'm just not a fan. And I think they could actually fix it, for me at least, with a relatively small change, which would be to change it to being purely player activated, rather than something you have to deal with just all the time based on dying. So basically what the madness system is that when your character dies or you defeat certain enemies, you gain madness. At various stages, as your madness increases, like 50, 90%, and 100, I believe it is, it has different effects both on if you drop your experience when you die. But once madness fully sets in, you deal more damage, but you also take more damage. The thing is though, even when you die, you gain madness, which means if you're making repeated attempts against a boss you are struggling with, eventually you're going to hit that madness cap, and it's going to cause you to take more damage from a boss you are already struggling with. And while yes, you do get a damage buff, against bosses it's a negligible amount of damage, especially on that first playthrough. And so what this winds up feeling like to me is a double punishment for failure. There's the fact that you have to run back, lose your experience, fight again, as is the case with these games, but now with this system, you've also caused me to take more damage and stuff until I go fix that. And there are two ways to fix it. Spend a limited resource item to have your madness cleared, or to go die somewhere else outside of a boss arena, which will summon an inner demon. There are two types of inner demons. There are 6 of them that spawn in set locations no matter what is going on, and then there are the inner demons that only spawn when you die at maximum madness. These guys scale with your level, actually, which means they actually do get very dangerous as you level up. In fact, one of them just straight up one-shot me at one point. And the catch about that is, if you keep dying in a consistent spot where you're having trouble with enemies, you might actually find even that is a little bit harder because you've just spawned this inner demon to deal with. And before somebody mentions it in the comments, yes, the inner demons will actually fight other enemies around you, so it is possible to use them to your advantage. I personally never found that to be terribly useful, but it is technically a thing that can happen. And for those reasons, I am just not a huge fan of this system, but I do think if you just changed it to being player activated, which the game already allows for, it could be much more fun to utilize. There are items and upgrades you can use that kind of lean into the madness mechanic that will just activate it basically straight away, rather than you having to wait on it by dying or whatever. And as a result, that makes sense because you are actively choosing to utilize a playstyle where you take more damage but deal increased damage as well. I think that's a perfectly fine playstyle to lean into, but I think the fact that it happens just because of you dying, especially in a game where you're meant to struggle and die against bosses as you overcome those challenges, is actively a detriment to most people. I'm sure some people will find it enjoyable, but as I mentioned, it kind of just feels like a double punishment for failure here, and I think that's going to put people off. And it's one of the reasons the first playthrough of this game wound up feeling not great to me, to be honest. But speaking of those boss fights, let's talk about them. Outside of a couple of bosses, I actually thought these guys were really, really cool. I really enjoyed fighting the human enemies, even though they were incredibly frustrating at times. And yet, through repeated attempts, it does that thing Souls-likes do, where you get better at it, you understand what their moveset is, what you can do to counter individual moves as you learn through your own failure. And there was an optional human boss towards the very end that I honestly don't want to show because it's a pretty big spoiler actually, that I think really exemplified this. That guy was just obliterating me. And yet through repeated attempts, I eventually just got to a point where I knew how to handle each and every one of his combos and how to react and move to them. And as a result, when I finally beat that guy, it felt extremely earned. Unfortunately, that is not all bosses though. A lot of them are just like almost laughably easy. Other times there's these huge difficulty spikes where you go from a laughably easy boss to a fight that is incredibly hard, due to a variety of things like, say, telegraphing that is extremely hard to see, or in some cases the game's own conveyance, like teaching you about weapon counters on a boss that uses attacks, that is to say non-weapon attacks, things like punches and kicks, etc., that you cannot actually counter with a weapon, which makes that fight in particular probably my least favorite. But nonetheless, I think there's a pretty high skill ceiling to these boss fights. For the most part, I enjoyed them. There's a lot of cool designs there. There's some fun fights. There's some fun movesets. And while I didn't love all of them, they were enjoyable both for the spectacle as well as the actual fights themselves for the most part. But that finally brings us to the Steam Deck section. Now, in what is somewhat of a surprise to me, happy to report that this game seems to be running very well on the Steam Deck, better than you would probably expect. And while the graphics lose a little bit of fidelity on that platform, to be sure, it's definitely very playable there. Gets a pretty solid FPS, not quite as great as something a little beefier, obviously, but I was able to hold a steady 30. I'm sure you could get more if you were willing to mess around with the settings. It obviously has controller support, and given that a lot of people prefer to play these games on controller, should be more than playable there. I will say for me personally, I actually hate playing these games with a controller. I do not have the muscle memory to do that well. Much to the surprise of many people, kind of the opposite for me. I vastly prefer to play these with a keyboard and mouse. I can do much, much better there because that's what I'm used to playing on. So I would not personally want to play games like this on the Steam Deck, but it should be more than doable. I didn't have any issues with it personally. So while the current rating is unknown, I would probably expect this to get a playable at the least rating. Sometimes they ding games for having really small text, and some various stat screens for things like a Souls-like can in fact be that way, so I think it might get dinged for that small text, but otherwise perfectly playable on that platform, which brings us to our positives and negatives. So on the positive side of things, for me at least, when the combat opens up, it gets really fun. On my second playthrough, really started having a blast with the combat system and being able to utilize it to its fullest, because it stopped feeling like I was being really restricted by the amount of skill points I had, and I could actually invest into things and just try different things, even via respecking, and I just had so much more fun playing this once I got to New Game Plus. So while it takes probably a little too long to get there, to be honest with you, combat is really fun. I really enjoyed the level design, like the biomes and the art direction and stuff. It's stuff we've seen before, to be clear, but it doesn't change the fact that it is enjoyable to run through those things, and I think it is definitely a highlight of a title like this. It was a lot of fun. Now luckily, I would say those are some of the primary things that a Souls-like this needs to concern itself with, but nonetheless there were some negatives. I didn't like one of the core systems, the madness system. Just wasn't for me. I'm sure some people will like it. I offered a solution, at the very least, kind of changing how it works to make it work for me, but as it stands with its current implementation, just not a fan. I don't like the way what I would consider default actions are bound to disciplines that have to be equipped to a weapon. I don't like how limited you feel in a first playthrough. I also feel like while this game has multiple endings, a lot of them don't really feel like they were worth the effort of getting. And then, of course, there's the fact that for many people on PC, performance of this game is frankly inadequate. And while that is not affecting absolutely everyone by any means, it's enough people to be of note if you are considering buying this, which brings me to my conclusion. Wuchang Fallen Feathers is ultimately what I would describe as a pretty good Souls-like. There are things I don't like about it, there are things I enjoy. Nothing about it is really groundbreaking or anything. It's a pretty by-the-books entry to the genre as far as I'm concerned. Now, for all of those reasons, plus the performance issues the game has, I think it's more than understandable that some people wouldn't want to pay $50 US for this. That said, the game is also on Game Pass, so you can try it out there if you have that subscription and not have to pay as much. And given that, again, it's a pretty standard entry into the genre, I don't think that's a bad way to play it. But if you like Souls-likes, my recommendation would be to simply wait these performance issues out, wait for them to get that stuff sorted out and patched up, hopefully, and then at that point, I think it would be worth its asking price price, but given that that will put it pretty close to sales actually, I would not be surprised at all to learn that some people are just waiting for the winter sale, things like that, to see if this winds up being cheaper then once all these performance issues are knocked out. But that's kind of where I'm at with it. If there weren't the risk of potentially catastrophic performance problems, I would be a little more enthusiastic about simply recommending it because I think it is mostly pretty good. And if you don't encounter performance problems, I think it's worth $50. But if you buy it and have those, then you'll probably wish you have bought it on sale. So for the most part, I would just say wait until these initial problems get fixed if you're on the fence about it. But that's where I'm at with it, so hopefully you enjoyed all of that. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.